the end of Reconstruction in 1877. The sources really flagged this as a pivotal moment, a major rollback, wasn't it?
It really was. Despite the promise, the huge promise of the post-Civil War amendments abolishing slavery, citizenship, equal protection, trying to secure voting rights, the withdrawal of federal troops in 77, it just allowed conservative forces, especially in the South, to regain control.
And they moved fast.
Very fast. They implemented things like the Black Codes, which were designed to severely restrict the freedom and labor of black citizens, and they used violence, intimidation. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan were central to suppressing civil rights, political rights.
So that hope for a truly inclusive post-slavery society was...
Oh, it was put on hold for a very long time. It was deferred, yeah. It really set the stage for decades of struggle against systemic injustice.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thread, running right through this history.
leading eventually to the civil rights movement much later.
Exactly. Which the sources call a dramatic yet peaceful revolution, but one that was deeply rooted in that earlier failure, those unmet promises of Reconstruction.
And while all this is happening in the South, the rest of the nation is experiencing something huge. The Second Industrial Revolution. The sources call it explosive, unprecedented.
Yeah, explosive is a good word. It's what made the U.S. the world's leading economic power by the end of the 19th century.
The scale of change must have been incredible.
Oh, absolutely. Think about steel production just soaring. Railroads, the Transcontinental Line was finished just before our period in '69, but the network just exploded after that, linking the whole continent, creating this vast national market.
And new technologies.
Right. Electrification, telecommunications.
Yeah.
People like Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell. These innovations were fundamentally changing daily life, changing commerce. It's hard to overstate.
But this massive growth, it also led to, well, massive corporations, trusts, monopolies.
Yes, absolutely. You get names like Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Carnegie and Morgan with U.S. Steel, Duke's American Tobacco. This is the era of the so-called robber barons, figures with immense, sometimes ruthless power.
And they had philosophies to back it up.
Oh, yeah. Ideas like social Darwinism, this sort of survival of the fittest applied to society and business, and laissez-faire economics, the idea that government should just stay out of the economy, were really prominent. They helped justify this huge concentration of wealth and power.
And all these factories, this industry, it pulled people into the cities, right? Huge urban growth.
Massive. It completely reshaped the country. The sources point out the 1920 census was the first time more Americans actually lived in cities than in rural areas. A huge shift.
Fueled by people moving from the countryside, but also immigrants.
Yes. Massive waves of immigrants, as the sources say, especially the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, also from Asia. They provided absolutely essential labor for the factories, the mines, construction.
But that caused friction, too.
It definitely did.
Yeah.
You see these significant nativist reactions, a backlash against the newcomers, fear, resentment. Even as these immigrant groups were forming their own really vibrant communities, ethnic neighborhoods, little Italies, Chinatowns, that sort of thing.
So lots of social tension brewing.
For sure. It wasn't just smooth sailing economic progress. You had serious labor struggles. Workers pushing back against really harsh conditions, low pay, things like the Haymarket Riot in 1886. That's mentioned as an early example.
And meanwhile, the push west hadn't stopped.
No, not at all. The sources remind us about the ongoing, often tragic conflicts with Native American tribes. Events like the Battle of Little Bighorn happened right at the start of our period, 1876, and then the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890.
Just brutal.
It involved the continued taking of tribal lands, forcing people onto reservations. It's another really difficult, complex part of the nation's expansion story during this time.
And connecting back to the South, that rollback of rights we started with, it gets cemented legally.
Yes, and this is crucial. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, that's the case that established the separate but equal doctrine.
Separate but never really equal.
Almost never in practice.
Yeah.
It gave the legal green light to racial segregation in almost every aspect of public life. It underpinned the whole Jim Crow system for more than half a century.
So internally, you've got rapid industrial change, labor conflict, solidifying racial oppression, continued westward expansion. But the U.S. is also starting to look outward more.
Right. The Spanish-American War in 1898 is really presented as a key turning point here. The U.S. wins, gets territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, exudes control over Cuba.
A step onto the world stage.
Definitely. It signals the U.S. emerging as a global power, though there was a lot of debate at home about whether this kind of imperialism was actually the right path for the country.
Okay, that sets us up nicely for the early 20th century, say 1900 to 1945 or so. This period seems packed reform, boom, bust, global war.
It's incredibly dense.
Yeah.
Let's start with the progressive era, roughly, the 1890s into the 1920s.
And this was what? A reaction.
Yeah, you can think of it as a broad response, really, to all those problems created by the rapid industrialization and urbanization we just talked about. The monopolies, the urban poverty, the political corruption. People felt things needed fixing.
So reformers trying to rein in capitalism a bit, maybe make democracy work better.
That's a good way to put it. Politically, you see pushes for things like the direct election of senators that becomes the 17th Amendment in 1913, and a huge democratic expansion was women's suffrage.
The 19th Amendment in 1920.
Exactly, granting women the vote after decades of struggle. And you had progressive presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson who championed a lot of these reforms.
What about the economy? Were they trying to regulate those big trusts?
Yes, definitely. There were efforts like antitrust actions. Roosevelt was known as the trust buster. The Federal Reserve System gets created in 1913 to try and stabilize banking and the economy. And the 16th Amendment, also 1913, brought in the federal income tax.
A huge change for government funding.
Massive. And they tackled social issues, too. Consumer protection. Think about Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle.
About the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, the horrific conditions. That led directly to things like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, plus efforts to limit child labor, the settlement house movement, with figures like Jane Addams trying to help the urban poor and immigrants.
Feels like a lot of positive change, but the sources mention limitations.
Oh, definitely. These reforms mostly benefited white middle-class Americans. For African Americans, segregation and disenfranchisement largely continued, even worsened in some areas. And nativism, that anti-immigrant feeling, actually intensified during this period, leading to more restrictive immigration laws down the line.
Then the world changes. World War I.
Right. Breaks out in Europe in 1914. The U.S. stays neutral at first for about 3 years.
But gets pulled in eventually.
Yeah. Germany resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships, plus the Zimmerman telegram, that intercepted message trying to get Mexico to ally with Germany against the U.S. Those are key triggers. The U.S. enters the war in April 1917.
Wilson's famous line, "Make the world safe for democracy."
That was the stated goal. The arrival of American troops, the AEF, in 1918 really helped to tip the balance against Germany. But back home, the war also meant cracking down on dissent. The Espionage and Sedition Acts limited free speech, which always raises that tension between security and liberty.
A big step onto the world stage, though.
A really significant shift towards greater U.S. international engagement. No turning back, really.
Okay, so after the war, we get the interwar period. Starts with the Roaring '20s.
Yeah, the 1920s, an era of pretty significant economic boom, at least on the surface. Mass production really takes off. Think Henry Ford and the automobile. Lots of new consumer goods, radios, appliances.
A different kind of culture emerging.
Absolutely. You get the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of black arts and culture, changing roles for women, the whole flapper image. But the sources are quick to point out, the prosperity wasn't evenly shared. Wealth inequality was a major underlying issue.
An issue that contributes to what comes next, the Great Depression.
Exactly. The stock market crash in October 1929 is the famous trigger. But the problems ran much deeper. You had all that speculation, a really fragile banking system, farmers struggling with overproduction and falling prices, that unequal wealth distribution we mentioned, and then environmental disaster too, the Dust Bowl.
Just devastating farms in the Midwest.
Wipe them out. The human cost of the Depression overall was just immense.
Hard to even imagine.
Widespread poverty, hunger like never before, homelessness, people living in shanty towns they called Hoovervilles, banks failing, people losing their life savings, unemployment just skyrocketed, hit maybe 25% by 1933. It was a genuine national crisis.
And the response shapes modern America, FDR's New Deal.
Absolutely transformative. It marks a fundamental shift in the relationship between the American people and the federal government. Really the end of that old laissez-faire idea.
So what did it do?
The New Deal unleashed this wave of programs focused on what they called the 3 Rs: relief, reform, and recovery.
Programs we still hear about today. Social Security.
Social Security is maybe the most famous legacy, creating that safety net for the elderly, the unemployed. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, ensuring bank deposits to restore confidence. Then you had programs like the WPA, the CCC, putting millions of people back to work on public projects.
A much bigger role for government.
Unprecedented.
Yeah.
The sources stress how the New Deal fundamentally expanded the role of the federal government in the economy and in social welfare. It established this idea of a government safety net and set precedents for intervention that are still debated today. Historians argue about how effective it was, what its long-term impact was, but its significance is undeniable.
But it wasn't the New Deal alone that ended the Depression.
That's generally agreed. Full economic recovery really only came with the massive mobilization for World War II. The U.S. tried to stay out again initially, acting as the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies through things like the Lend-Lease program.
Until Pearl Harbor.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. That attack brought the U.S. directly and fully into World War II.
And American industry and military power were key.
Absolutely decisive in defeating the Axis powers. The home front mobilized on an incredible scale. Women flooding into factory jobs. Rosie the Riveter becomes the symbol. Rationing, war bonds. But also, we have to remember the darker side, like the internment of Japanese Americans.
No.
A terrible injustice fueled by wartime fear.
And the war concludes with a terrifying new weapon.
The Manhattan Project. The secret development of the atomic bomb. The U.S. used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender. It ended the war, but ushered in the nuclear age and came at an immense human cost, hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians killed, and around 400,000 U.S. military deaths over the course of the war.
So, 1945. The war ends. The U.S. is, well, it's on top of the world.
Yeah, emerges as the dominant global power, economically strongest, militarily unparalleled, and initially the only one with nuclear weapons. This is when you see the creation of institutions like the United Nations, the Bretton Woods economic system, trying to shape the post-war order.
But almost immediately, a new global conflict takes shape, the Cold War.
Right. From about 1947 all the way to 1991, this becomes the defining feature of international relations, this intense rivalry, this tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, a bipolar world.
Based on ideology, capitalism versus communism.
Fundamentally, yes. Democratic capitalism led by the U.S. versus Soviet communism. And U.S. policy quickly coalesced around containment.
It's trying to stop Soviet influence from spreading.
Exactly. Using various tools.
Yeah.
Economic aid, like the Marshall Plan for Europe, military alliances like NATO, formed in '49, and unfortunately getting involved in proxy conflicts.
Like Korea and Vietnam.
Yes, the Korean War in the early 50s, and then the much longer, more divisive involvement in Vietnam, especially from the mid-60s through the early 70s. Plus, the constant terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation, the arms race. And domestically, this period also saw the Red Scare and McCarthyism in the late 40s and early 50s, that anti-communist paranoia leading to blacklists and ruined lives.
But despite all that global tension, the post-war years at home were also a time of incredible economic growth.
Phenomenal growth, really. From the mid-40s into the 70s, the U.S. experienced this long boom, becoming easily the world's richest country. The middle class expanded dramatically.
What drove that?
Several things. The GI Bill was huge, helping millions of returning veterans get education, buy homes. This fueled a housing boom, consumer spending took off, led to massive suburbanization.
And the government played a role, too.
Yeah, the federal government's role, already expanded by the New Deal and the war, continued to grow. Think of the interstate highway system, initiated under Eisenhower. Truman's Fair Deal aimed to build on the New Deal, though not all of it passed.
But amidst this prosperity, this Cold War fear, another major struggle was gaining force, the Civil Rights Movement.
Yes, huge momentum in the post-war years. Building on generations of resistance, obviously, and directly challenging that Jim Crow system established back after Reconstruction failed.
The goal was clear. End legal segregation, discrimination, secure voting rights.
Exactly. And the movement used a whole range of tactics. Litigation was key. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, striking down school segregation, was monumental.
But also direct action.
Absolutely critical. Nonviolent direct action became incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
The Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, often using that jail no bail strategy to fill the jail's voter registration drives in dangerous areas. The March on Washington in '63, the Selma marches in '65.
And the sources really emphasized this was led by African Americans themselves facing incredible resistance.
Yes. Designed, led, organized, and manned by African Americans, as one source puts it, facing down brutal violence, intimidation, police dogs, fire hoses. It took immense courage.
But it led to landmark laws.
It did. This is sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. You get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, finally outlawing segregation in public places and discrimination in employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had a huge impact on black voter registration and political power, especially in the South, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
A revolution, peacefully achieved, mostly.
A dramatic yet peaceful revolution, yeah. It dismantled the legal structure of Jim Crow, though obviously the fight for true equality and against systemic racism continues.
Then we hit the 1970s, which the sources portray as, well, turbulent.
A really challenging decade. Multiple crises seem to converge. You have the difficult, divisive end of the Vietnam War. Continued social unrest. The women's rights movement, for instance, was gaining enormous momentum through the 60s and 70s.
And the economy hit a wall.
Yeah, the long post-war boom kind of sputtered out. The U.S. went off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods system. Then the 1973 Arab oil embargo triggered an energy crisis, gas lines, and you got stagflation.
That weird combination of stagnation, high unemployment, and high inflation at the same time.
Exactly. It baffled economists and hurt ordinary people. And you also start seeing the early signs of deindustrialization, the decline of those traditional manufacturing jobs in places like the Rust Belt.
Plus, a crisis of political trust.
Oh, absolutely. Watergate. Nixon's resignation in 1974 just shattered public confidence in government. In foreign policy, you see shifts like Nixon opening relations with China, détente with the Soviets trying to ease tensions, signing arms control deals like Saltai, but also ongoing instability, like the Iran hostage crisis that began under Carter in '79.
Which leads us into the 1980s and a shift towards conservatism with Ronald Reagan.
Right. Reagan represented a significant conservative turn. Emphasis on free market policies, tax cuts, deregulation, and a very assertive, strong anti-communist stance, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire.
Though there was still some diplomacy.
Yes, periods of renewed détente happened too, like the INF Treaty in '87 eliminating certain nuclear missiles. But the overall tone was more confrontational than in the '70s.
And then, almost unexpectedly for many, the Cold War just ends.
It happened remarkably fast. The Berlin Wall falls in '89, Soviet bloc countries break away, and then the Soviet Union itself collapses in December 1991.
Leaving the U.S. as the sole superpower.
Suddenly, the whole global landscape is transformed, which brings us into the contemporary era, from '91 to today.
And the sources are really clear. This period faces complex challenges that directly echo those long-standing tensions and debates from the history we've just covered.
Absolutely. The post-Cold War world looked different, but new threats emerged. Security was completely reshaped by the September 11th attacks in 2001.
Which led to the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, highlighting these new challenges of asymmetric warfare against non-state groups, and domestically ongoing concerns about things like gun violence, cybersecurity.
And economically, globalization accelerated, bringing benefits but also new insecurities for American workers. Then you have the 2008 global financial crisis, a huge shock to the system.
And that long-term shift in the economy continues.
Right, away from manufacturing towards a service and knowledge-based economy, tech, finance, healthcare. But this has created, as the sources note, really stark regional disparities.
Like thriving coastal cities versus struggling former industrial areas.
Exactly. And that fuels growing income inequality, sharpening class divisions, which, remember, echoes way back to the Gilded Age. Government responses tried to stabilize things like Dodd-Frank regulating finance after '08 or the auto bailout, kind of echoing those New Deal interventions.
Politically, though, the defining feature seems to be polarization.
It's become incredibly pronounced. The sources call this the polarization era. They point to factors like partisan media creating separate information ecosystems, gerrymandering, the influence of primaries, even just people sorting themselves geographically to live near others who think like them, all reducing cross-partisan understanding.
And this has led to real concerns about democratic health.
Yeah, the sources point to things like the January 6th Capitol riot in 2021, challenging the election results, as a really alarming symptom. They even connect this back to older worries, like Tocqueville's concerns about the tyranny of the majority or the manipulation of public opinion, things that feel very relevant today with social media and intense partisanship. And that tension between secularism and religion, he noted, still here.
Socially and culturally, the country just keeps getting more diverse.
Yeah, especially due to immigration patterns changing after 1965. Large increases in Hispanic and Asian populations particularly. This constantly brings up those fundamental questions about national identity assimilation, multiculturalism, what the sources call ongoing identity struggles, echoing earlier immigrant waves, and of course the long history of race in America. And the women's rights movement continues to evolve too.
And we can't ignore environmental issues.
No, they've become central contemporary challenges. Climate change impacts, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts are becoming more obvious. Debates over energy, regulation, sustainability, they're huge.
And finally, America's role in the world. After being the sole superpower, it's now seen as more in flux.
That's how the sources frame it. There are ongoing debates about American leadership, alliances, responsibilities, especially as other major powers like China and India rise and reshape the global order.
Wow, okay. So looking back over this whole period since 1876, it's just this incredible arc from Reconstruction's aftermath through explosive industrialization, major reforms, economic crises, world wars, the Cold War, civil rights breakthroughs, right up to today's complex mix of inequality, polarization, identity debates, environmental concerns, and a shifting global position.
It's a narrative of immense change, immense progress in many ways, but also these incredibly persistent challenges and deep structural issues. The sources really hammer home that understanding this complex history, how these issues developed, how they connect, is just essential to making any sense of the United States today. Still wrestling, as they say, with its founding contradictions.
It really isn't a finished story, is it? Definitely gives you a lot to think about.